There's a specific moment when most people give up, when the weight of what they're not becomes heavier than the possibility of what they could be. That moment came for Sarah at 18, but instead of breaking, she did something quieter. She left. What followed was a decade and a half of complete invisibility. Nobody knew her name, nobody cared, and that was exactly the point. Today, she controls an empire worth more money than most people will see in 10 lifetimes, but almost nobody knows it. That's the real story here, not the success, the secrecy. Let's go back to the beginning. Sarah came from a place where ambition meant nothing if you weren't the right kind of kid. Her older brother, we'll call him Michael, he was the golden child. Perfect grades, perfect prospects, perfect everything. Sarah's grades were good, his were better. She made the soccer team, he was captain. By the time she was a teenager, something had settled into place, an understanding. She was the comparison that made him look good. That was her role in the family. Her mother rarely looked at her without a specific kind of expression. It wasn't anger, it was disappointment. The kind that suggests you're a disappointment simply by existing. One day, Sarah looked at her life and asked a simple question: what's keeping me here? The answer was nothing. So she took a bus to the city with $200 in her pocket and a refusal to fail. The first 2 years were exactly what everyone at home imagined. Ramen noodles, a studio apartment the size of a closet, working multiple jobs just to stay afloat. But she didn't spend those years suffering in secret. She spent them learning. She got a job as a housekeeper at a small hotel, not the kind of job that builds prestige, the kind that builds understanding. She watched the managers. She watched how money moved. She watched how systems worked, and she learned. By 25, she'd moved into management. By 28, she owned her first property. By 30, she owned 3. When she turned 31, she had quietly built a hospitality company that controlled 6 boutique hotels along the Eastern Seaboard. Her family had no idea. They still saw her the same way, struggling, desperate to prove something. The funny part? She had stopped trying to prove anything to them years ago. One night, Sarah's mother called, a last-minute invitation to her brother's engagement party. Sarah almost didn't go. Then something made her change her mind. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was one final hope that things could be different, that they'd finally see her. She drove through her hometown first, not out of nostalgia, just to remind herself why she'd left. When she arrived at the hotel, her hotel, though nobody knew it, she was wearing jeans and boots, simple clothes that cost more money than most people realized, but didn't advertise it. That was the whole point. The fiancée's name was Victoria, and within 5 minutes of meeting her, Sarah understood something was deeply wrong. Not about Victoria specifically, about everything. Victoria made a comment, loud enough for everyone to hear, about where Sarah had come from. The way she said it made clear that Sarah was something to be endured, an embarrassment, the kind of person you acknowledge just enough to prove you're not a terrible person, but not so much that anyone thinks you actually like her. Sarah's mother overheard and did nothing. Her brother overheard and said nothing. And Sarah realized in that moment that the small hope she'd arrived with was already dead. What Victoria didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that Sarah had just bought another property that week, that the building they were standing in belonged to her, that every chandelier, every piece of silver, every square inch of marble underneath Victoria's designer heels was owned by the person Victoria had just dismissed. Sarah found a quiet corner and a drink. She watched the party from the margins, which is where she was comfortable. But then she saw something that changed everything. Her brother pulled her aside. He mentioned that their mother had given Victoria their grandmother's necklace, a piece their grandmother had promised to Sarah on her deathbed, a piece that meant something specific, a promise that Sarah would be the one who did something with her life, that she'd be the one who mattered. And there it was. hanging around Victoria's neck like a trophy she didn't understand the value of. Sarah excused herself. She needed to think. It was in a hallway near the restrooms that she overheard a phone conversation, Victoria's father on the line with someone, saying something that made no sense. He said the wedding needed to happen. He said they needed to get ahead of something. He said the family had enough money to fix this. He said once the ceremony was done, everything would be fine. Sarah froze. Something about that conversation didn't fit the narrative she was seeing. Everything about Victoria's family screamed old money, but people who have old money don't sound desperate, they sound comfortable. She spent the next hour watching them differently, looking for the cracks in the facade, and she found them. Constant phone checking, expensive jewelry worn like it might disappear, smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Sarah's understanding of what was happening shifted. This wasn't a wedding, this was an exit strategy. She pulled her general manager aside, a man named David who'd worked for her for 8 years and asked very few questions. She asked him to find everything he could about Victoria's family, business records, news articles, anything. David didn't ask why. He'd learned a long time ago that Sarah operated on information she'd already processed. He just nodded and disappeared. While she waited, Victoria found her. The conversation that followed was designed to hurt. Victoria explained, with the kind of confidence only someone living a lie can manage, that she knew Sarah's truth, that Sarah was broke, that the money Sarah sent home came from pity, that nobody would miss her, that Victoria and Michael were going to be happy, and Sarah should just stay out of the way. Victoria called her pathetic. She patted her hand like someone consoling a child, and she walked away smiling. Sarah stood there, understanding that Victoria believed every word she'd said, but not because it was true, because Victoria had been lied to. Michael had painted Sarah as a struggling sister, still trying to prove her worth, and Victoria had accepted that story completely. The irony was so thick you could touch it. David returned with a folder. His expression said everything before he opened his mouth. Victoria's family wasn't just wealthy, they were under federal investigation, not just for one scheme, for years of fraud, a Ponzi operation that had destroyed dozens of families. But here's what made it worse. Victoria's name wasn't Victoria. Court records from Arizona showed a woman named Sandra Williams, different hair color, same cold eyes, same pattern of behavior. The family had multiple identities, multiple states, multiple victims. Sarah sat in her car and laughed, not because it was funny, because she understood now what was really happening. Victoria had targeted Michael because she thought his family had money, but they didn't. Sarah had been secretly funding them. Their mother thought Michael was the provider. Victoria thought she'd found a wealthy family to hide inside during the collapse. Nobody knew the truth, and Sarah had to make a choice. She called her lawyer. She called a forensic accountant. She told them both what she knew and asked them to confirm it. Both calls came back the same. Victoria's family was finished. The investigation was closing in. Federal agents were ready to move. Sarah could have warned her family. She could have let them discover this themselves. She could have stayed silent and let the consequences play out naturally. Part of her wanted to do exactly that. But Michael was still the boy who taught her to ride a bike, even if he'd forgotten. Her mother was still the woman who stayed awake all night when she had chickenpox, even if she'd decided Sarah wasn't worth remembering. Family is complicated. You can love people and hate what they've done. You can want to protect them even when they've shown you they won't protect you. So she made a decision. She was going to stop Victoria's family herself. She was going to do it publicly, and she was going to do it tonight. Sarah had her IT director prepare a presentation, financial records, court documents, photographs of Sandra Williams under her real name, years younger, standing next to Victoria's supposed parents under completely different identities, evidence of the Ponzi scheme,
evidence of the ongoing fraud, evidence that this family had been running the same con for over a decade. When Victoria's father stood to make his toast, everything was ready. He talked about love, he talked about family, he talked about legacy. Every word was a lie. Then the screens behind him flickered to life. The room went silent in the specific way a room goes silent when reality collapses. The happy family photographs disappeared, replaced by court documents stamped with official seals. The words "investment fraud investigation" appeared in bold letters. Victoria's father's smile froze on his face. Her mother's hands began to shake. Victoria herself looked like someone waking up from a dream she didn't want to leave. Sarah watched from the back of the room as the machinery she'd set in motion began to work. Her people moved into position. The federal agents outside, who'd been waiting for this moment, prepared to move in. But Sarah didn't hide. She walked forward. Every eye in the room followed her. The woman in jeans and boots, the woman they'd all dismissed, the woman who owned the building they were standing in. She took the microphone from Victoria's father's hand and introduced herself, not as a guest, as the owner of the hotel, as the CEO of the hospitality company that controlled the space they were all in, as the person who just exposed them. Victoria's family began to unravel in real time. Victoria's father tried to run. Federal agents stopped him before he made 10 feet. Her mother began to cry, real tears, the kind that come from understanding that everything is over. Victoria herself looked at Michael one final time. She begged him to stop this. She told him they loved each other. She told him he should have trusted her. Michael looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked away. He said he didn't even know who she was. That was when Victoria's mask fell completely. She lunged at Sarah, screaming. Security caught her before she got close. As they escorted her out, still screaming, Sarah leaned in close enough that only Victoria could hear. She told her something simple, that the jeans-wearing small-town girl owned this room, that the small-town girl signed every paycheck, that the small-town girl would sleep perfectly tonight, knowing exactly who she was.
The engagement party didn't end. Sarah's instructions were clear. The food was paid for, the bar stayed open. It would be a waste to let good hospitality go unused. Someone even started dancing. By morning, the story had exploded. Local news called it the hospitality magnate who exposed the con. One headline called her the small-town girl who owned the room. Sarah had that headline framed. It hangs in her office now, where she sees it every morning. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in her office and looked out at the city. Victoria's family was facing federal charges on multiple counts. The real investigation was just beginning. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt something shift. The weight she'd been carrying, the need to prove something, the anger at being dismissed, it was finally settling. Michael came to visit her office the next week. He walked through it like someone visiting a museum, touching things like he needed to confirm they were real. He said he'd spent his whole life thinking he understood who Sarah was. He'd been completely wrong. They had lunch together, a real one, not a family obligation, not something they avoided. They actually talked. Sarah's mother called. Her voice was small and uncertain. She said she'd started therapy. She said she wanted to understand why she'd treated Sarah the way she had. She said she wanted to do better. Sarah told her that was okay, that they could move slowly, that rebuilding trust takes time. But at least they were finally building something instead of watching it collapse. A few days later, Sarah was having a business breakfast in her hotel restaurant. A young woman came in. She was clearly out of place. Simple clothes, nervous energy. One of the investors at her table made a comment, loud enough for everyone to hear. He asked who'd let her in and said this was a private event. Sarah stood up. She walked to the young woman and shook her hand warmly. She introduced her to the table as the recipient of a scholarship. She explained that this girl had come from a small town in Ohio. She'd worked 2 jobs to pay for community college. She was heading to Cornell in the fall to study hotel management. The investor suddenly became very interested in his coffee. Sarah put the young woman at her table, at the same table as the people who'd just written her off as someone beneath them. She leaned over and told her something. She said that if she ever felt like she didn't belong somewhere, she should remember this, that most people who build beautiful things started with nothing but stubbornness and a dream. By afternoon, Sarah was standing in the lobby of her hotel, watching people come and go. Business people, tourists, families. They moved through spaces she owned, slept in beds she paid for, experienced hospitality she'd built, completely unaware of the woman who made it possible. And that was fine. She didn't need them to know. There's a particular kind of strength that comes from being underestimated. While people are busy looking down at you, they don't see you rising. Sarah had learned that lesson in a town too small to matter, in a family that made her feel disposable, in a city that didn't care who she was. She'd carried that lesson with her through every struggle, every doubt, every person who told her she'd never measure up. And now, standing in her own hotel, surrounded by everything she'd built, she understood something fundamental. The people who dismiss you aren't weak, they're not cruel, they're just limited. They can only see what's in front of them. They can't imagine someone building something beautiful in the margins. They can't conceive of someone succeeding while invisible. There's a question people always ask when they learn this story. They want to know if Sarah felt vindicated, if the exposure, the public humiliation of the people who'd hurt her, if that finally felt like justice. The answer is more complicated than that. Yes, Victoria's family was stopped before they could hurt anyone else. Yes, Michael finally saw his sister clearly. Yes, their mother is trying to change. But none of that was the real victory. The real victory was that Sarah had built something real while everyone was busy not believing in her. The real victory was that she'd already won before the evening of the party even began. The rest was just information coming to light. In the end, there's a specific kind of strength that comes from building something in the dark, from succeeding while invisible, from becoming so substantial that when you finally step into the light, nobody can pretend you were ever small. That power doesn't come from the moment people finally see you. It comes from years and years of seeing yourself clearly, even when nobody else does. That's the real story. Not the fall of a criminal family, not the rise of a hospitality magnate, but the quiet, invisible architecture of a life built on refusal. Refusal to accept what people told her she was. Refusal to break when she was supposed to. Refusal to need their approval before building something that mattered. Sarah didn't become powerful on the night of the engagement party. She'd been powerful for years. The party was just the moment everyone else caught up.